Okay. Hello. This is the Realm of Ideas is Free to All. This is number 8, and the title is Architecture is a Verb. I started these talks, my ruminations, on December. So we've gone through December now into January, closing in January. Next week is a nice week because it's actually the Saturday will be my 30th anniversary with my greatest loved one, Julie Rower, the painter and writer extraordinaire.
I love you, Puddle.
I love you, Puddle. Actually, you kind of we could do an anniversary one next week.
Sure.
Next week is, let's see, it's drawing. Oh, awesome. Okay. So basically, let me recap here. We've gone through the operation of the metaphor, which I feel is a kind of very fundamental, foundational thing for my work, and also my kind of the way I discipline my process of thinking, as well as the things that I do in research. Second was the idea of criticism and how criticism is a kind of important aspect of how things go about in terms of operation. And then we kind of fended off last week with the idea of the view of criticism as an indicator of societal health. And I kind of made my feeling that we actually are in a situation where those principles of what I call unbreakable bonds have been under siege by certain circumstances in our society that look to weaken the foundations of what we use to kind of create work of consequence. So anyway, with that as a foundation, I think we can start to go now into architecture, which is my chosen field, my field of research. And this is a kind of a good place to kind of identify what I feel is the difference between what is standard architectural practice, what most people would say, like your uncle Cameron, who basically has a small architectural firm and does houses and buildings and things like that, and what I do or don't. So we kind of might be kind of looked at the title and say well, I don't know, how can architecture be a verb? Architecture immediately is a noun, because I know that the church was done by the architect, and I know that there was an architect who designed such and such a building, or I know that Kennedy Airport, blah blah blah, the TWA piece by Errol Saarinen, that was done. He was a famous architect, and these are all true. And that does not mean that the noun, the object, the thing is not part of the architectural realm. It's just a different aspect of what that is as regards my thinking about the activity of architecture. So I guess to put it in simple terms, my belief is that you as an individual, the process by which you act has an architectural component, if that makes sense. So you have these things that you do that makes you identifiable as kind of considering yourself in that realm. So you architect as you would run or you would swim. So and that the building basically is a repository of that activity, just the same way that we would manifest those activities. And I think that we as a society go through a series of shifts and kind of tumbles as we move towards things like we talked about the unbreakable bond, which is the idea of a proto metaphor. Maybe it's important to recap on that, is that certain times in society we can see progress, or we can see advancement, because we put together those two concepts that actually have a very valuable component that we realize kind of maybe unhooks or kind of supersedes other circumstances. And the example that we used was the fact that technique or technology has oftentimes been linked to superstition, or linked to kind of religion or other things, whereas in Western society we have seen other times where it's been the case, and then kind of it's been removed, and then was reestablished, I guess, in the Renaissance, and that we realized that, the relationship between technique or technology and rationality and science gave us a valuable circumstance that was to our benefit. So rather than kind of doing a rain dance and expecting that we would actually have rain, or these horrible barbaric practices of human sacrifices and sacrificing virgins and animals, which is just completely bizarre, was something that we realized there's no discernible reason to believe that these things have any discernible consequence in actually bringing about the result we want. Whereas by kind of like understanding the relationship between science and technology, we're able to kind of understand how to better improve and advance these things with specific, discernible data, and that we realize this is a beneficial thing. So in that regard, what we established, or I asserted, even I don't think it was established, but I asserted that, the onslaught and the siege under which criticism exists in our society is an indication that some of the robustness of these liberal intentions and ideas is under siege. So that was the kind of case where, with the idea of criticism, we talked about the nature of criticism, its essential nature, the value of it in terms of being good at it, and then we talked about the societal relationship of that and how important that is, and how we are slipping in terms of letting other things supersede these valuable circumstances that we put together in terms of unbreakable bonds that now look to be unsettled. So we cannot say that architecture is not a noun. I'm just kind of like associating the idea of the term with a different operation, saying that it's an activity rather than a result. Not to say that the result isn't part of the activity, but it maybe could be the end result, or just could be a kind of reflection of the process, but it is a discernible part, because I think that other things within that put me in the position where I kind of start to kind of see what that may indeed be. Um, so, how did we come to that conclusion? I went to architectural school, was an architectural professor. I've worked in architectural firms, had an architectural firm at one point. Now work in construction management, general contracting, had a design build firm. So basically, I have existed in terms of my uh, activities pretty much throughout this entire realm of building. But one thing that was always in common was my own particular research that started probably before I stopped being a student, and definitely continues when I'm a young professor. I realized at a certain point that there was no need to continue to be a professor in order to continue my research, as I kind of pretty much knew that all I needed was a desk and some paper. So there was no need to kind of like engage in what I found was, let's say, messy circumstance. And as time goes on, and as I kind of uh, convene and discuss with some of my friends who are still in architectural academic practice, I find that that was part of why I started to kind of become even more concerned. And I kind of spoke about it last week, about the fact that as I realized that the idea of criticism, and by that I mean the observation of objects in order to kind of like discern consequence, came under siege, it became more and more difficult to actually engage in critical activity, to the point where even in the situations where it was necessary, like an academic setting, it has become incredibly tumultuous and difficult, to the point where I think that it is very much at risk at this point. So I have always continued on, and realized that that research that I engage in, we'll talk more about that in coming weeks, it is that which is most important to me. So in a way, these ruminations are basically just correlations of myself with my ideas for my better understanding. And in the process of kind of having done these on another platform and then moving over here, I find that they've been useful in terms of me helping clarify these ideas for myself, because a lot of these things go back 30, even 40 years to some of these things, to the roots when I was an architectural student. And, having done lectures, kind of talks and panel discussions and architectural, engagement, I find that like it's for me, I kind of like a valuable thing to kind of start uh, to show, like, to kind of bring these things under kind of like one umbrella to kind of maybe possibly put them in a certain form. So now this starts to me when I started to think about the nature of the definition of the term. When I'm in architectural school, before architectural school, I always loved building. I'd always kind of was building, folding, making, drawing, sketching. Like I said, I think Leonardo was my role model. He basically gave me the sense of a life of trying to understand the nature of things that they are. And then I guess maybe because of that, when I came across the term architecture when I entered school, and I kind of like got to understand the Greek term of arche and tekton and what these words meant and what they were alleged to believe in terms of the translation into kind of like today, I started to realize how there was maybe a potential or a possibility for myself to engage in it in a way, even if it was my own private investigation, that was more satisfying in terms of the desires and interests that I had in my own kind of like somewhat adventurous imagination. So the two terms that this comes from the ancient Greek are arche and tekton. And just a simple definition of arche and tekton would go as follows. Um, Not a Greek scholar, not an ancient Greek scholar, but for the most part, the simple understanding is the idea of arche is origins, first principles, structures, underlying components. And tekton is basically craftsman, carpenter, builder. And the two things were fit together in the fact that most people would tell you when you're a first year architectural student, or if they were going to explain to you what an architect was, you are the master builder. Now, in the way in which architecture was practiced in history, this was truly the case. There was an individual who was, and in fact, that now kind of comes into legal definitions, and there's things that exist in construction right now in terms of ways in which people conduct themselves or can call themselves. I cannot technically call myself an architect because I don't have an architectural license, because I never took the exam, because my feeling was, as an academic, there was no need to do that. And given the time in the 1980s when I was an academic, a lot of small architectural practice was done as a designer and an academic. And if you had a partner who was a licensed architect, you could work under their license. Or a lot of people basically would just stay away from the stipulations where you needed to have someone to kind of sign off on your drawings. So there was like the legal stipulations of architect came with certain ramifications that in that time, basically, there was really, you were going to be an academic and you were basically going to have a small kind of boutique firm. And if you ever got to the point where you kind of were to do larger work, you would worry about that when you got it. But given the insurance for liability concern for a person who was not really in practice, it was just not financially viable. So it really wasn't something people took the exam to have it. I always looked at it like if I ever needed the exam, I would take it. That's also an interesting explanation, an interesting kind of history thing, because it's kind of the architectural exam. A lot of people now are complaining that the architectural exam is too easy, and that the exam that they took back in the 80s and the 90s has become lost, and there are too many people who are taking this exam and passing the exam without really having the expertise. The design portion has disappeared. There's no more drawing, and everything. Remember, like that. I helped people study for it. I kind of like, but again, I was never interested. So anyway, so as a result of that, master builder was the person who was the individual who was capable of understanding the nature of the work so he could explain it in terms of what needed to be constructed on site. Today, the concept of master builder is a kind of emerging term in terms of like what I would say is the post-industrial or kind of like neo-technological or kind of what I would say pre-organic nature, where the superintendent and the architect, which had been separated because of the complexity of the tasks, given the rise of industrial technology, are now starting to become able to be kind of discernible under one brain. So I think that the idea of a master builder is something as a concept I feel comfortable with, in terms of the fact that having spent many years in the trades and in not swinging a hammer, but as a kind of superintendent and a construction manager, I understand that there are aspects of how building takes place. There was an interesting investigation and probably had a lot of value to me. So that kind of became part of that exercise. And though it wasn't a conscious exercise, it wasn't a conscious decision, it turned out to be, for more than a few reasons, actually quite prudent. And I think as a result, it kind of kept me from making a lot of kind of ideological mistakes in terms of my own particular approach. And I will go into that. I think we might see more of that in some of the kind of like next couple of talks, especially when we start to talk about, the nature of like what my work is and the nature of the architectural environment that I kind of grew up into, its problems and issues, and how it was really fortunate to avoid a lot of the kind of machinations, either kind of like accidentally or on purpose. So back to these two terms. I remember there's a beautiful painting by Paul Klee at the Met. It's not, unfortunately, it's not up now, but it's a beautiful painting, and it's called "The One Who Understands," and I call it "The Understander." And I think for me, that was always a great piece in terms of the fact that this idea of the individual who basically understands fundamental principles or looks to understand fundamental principles was very much in keeping with my idea of Leonardo and my idea of myself, in terms of the fact that rather than necessarily simply doling out the work to individuals based on the principles that you understood, you studied these principles and wanted to understand these principles in terms of like what fundamentally they were, which made this, at least in that time for me, a research engagement. So for me, there was always that idea of research as an endeavor for architects. Now, interestingly, in the 1980s, there were very few people who had any kind of research inclination. But fortunately, now one of the things I'm very proud to say is that as architecture becomes unshackled from some of its errors, it's starting to realize the benefit of actual research. And I hope that continues, because I feel that that's become something that is very much of value and a consequence. So I think that that was what started to lead me to the idea of, just like with the metaphor, of the process of generation. And the process of the generation of artifacts, to me, was that activity. So that architecture, in that case, that I was the individual who understood fundamental principles in terms of, that was my investigation. That was, to me, what made, that's beautiful. Oh, puddle, look, oh my God. This is, let's see if I can find that. That is Paul Klee's painting. Doing these things backwards is so annoying.
I know.
So there it is. Can you see that? That's The One Who Understands by Paul Klee on the Met's website, Metropolitan Museum of Art. Beautiful painting. Used to hang next to the Picasso piece. What was the Picasso piece he used to sit next to? Remember?
The man with the lollipop.
Oh yeah, the man with the lollipop. Oh my God. Unfortunately, it's been down for a while. But I think for me, that idea of understanding and trying to discern principles was, I think, for me, what is at the essence of the work of Leonardo. So that made perfect sense for me. So pretty much when I'm, I guess, starting to make the transition from student to professor, I'm starting to identify this idea of a process. Now, I was not the first. Oh, there it is. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Cool. So I did not originate this concept. I believe this concept, it was something that I remember was being talked about by some of my colleagues at the time. And I really kind of felt that though they had understood the potential, it was something that I think, being identified to it brought me to my own particular approach, which I feel has been a very fruitful investigation and been much a satisfaction in my life. So in that regard, it also kind of started to identify certain activities as necessary to learn in order to be able to kind of like engage in this activity of architecture. Now, for some people, it's walking, or it's kind of feeling the heat on your face, or the cold on your body, or it's engaging in yourself in your environment. I used to say, Ortega Gasset has a great saying, which is, I am myself and my circumstance. And I basically felt that that was a quintessential architectural statement. My feeling was my assertion of myself into nature is architecture. So my assertion of myself, or anyone's assertion of themselves, is in that existential way an architectural engagement. And that, again, like what's interesting is I find that maybe there's a kind of correlation, to this idea that, when people kind of think about supreme beings, if such a thing exists, or kind of like, kind of fundamental ideas of an individual, it's never it's never an insurance adjuster. It's never a used car salesman, though some religions it might as well be. It's never a lawyer. Like they always talk about the divine architect, the supreme architect. I think, and that also gave me this idea of like, fundamental principles, or the beginning ideas of structure. So again, we come back to that idea that there are these things that I felt what made architecture seem, at least to me, more process and activity driven than it was actually the kind of the results of the process. But the artifacts can be a good example for other people to kind of see the benefits of the work. And of course, the thing is, you are kind of working in the generative process towards creating artifacts. So, I mean, I kind of came up at a certain point of the idea of like architecturally provocative artifacts being things that you would study rather than things that you would say were finished. So part of what I would call organic design thinking, which we'll go into in the future, is part of that activity. In fact, one of the things I'm excited about tonight is I've started thinking about a kind of an idea that Julie and I have been thinking about. It's actually related to her process of activity, which I might be able to start using my drawing ability to start to generate in terms of what I would call a truly organic architecture, which has been my desire for my whole life. If I achieve that in my life, that's fine. If I don't, I mean, I want to leave that, as kind of like, okay, this was a worthy investigation. This was a worthwhile pursuit that I would say made a life worth living. So, given whatever time is left to me, the idea is what can I do between now and then in terms of kind of like being able to delineate a truly organic architecture. And that's also something I'll talk about in the coming weeks, is that one of the reasons I think that architecture kind of strayed from a very useful path as a result of whatever the reason was before certain people kind of like, I feel, meddled or kind of like messed up the circumstance, was that America had a very true impulse moving into the middle of the 20th century and the end of the 20th century that was subverted foolishly, and I would say maybe even a little bit petty for the reasons behind it. But I feel as if that diversion has kind of like run its course, and that obstacle is kind of being dissolved, and people are moving back towards those things that I think we should have been working on 50 years ago. Anyway, that aside, I still feel that this is the direction that we should have been going in, and now I feel as if there's the opportunity to continue the investigation. So that said, hopefully this made a certain amount of sense in terms of what we are doing, in terms of the fact that we create an activity that is an architectural activity. It's an action, that the process of generation of artifacts is actually the architectural engagement, not simply the artifacts themselves, as the artifacts themselves can be, like the metaphor, fluid and kind of like can be reintroduced and reactivated. So organic design thinking is kind of this idea of basically not having a is kind of like the delineation and appropriation and understanding of artifacts as they emerge, rather than a conscious desire to create a certain thing. I felt that, one of the things that we don't do is integrate the unconscious as enough of an activator of generation. So that was one of the other things that I've tried to do. So in fact, one of the things I always felt was a reasonably important criticism was like generative strategy. I don't know what it has always been something architects talked about as students and as faculty. Oh, generative strategy. Oh, I just did this. I just that. And I said, and one of my critiques of this was always, well, if you have a novel generative strategy, it should manifest itself in some way that I can see it. But if you produce the same artifacts and they look identical to everyone else, how novel is this? How consequential is this? Now, it doesn't have to be novel to be consequential, but to be consequential, and if it should be novel if that was your goal. And, so I looked at it like, and think in this case, the fact that the artifacts are not the final stage, but simply kind of like crystallizations or kind of like correlations, was something that I think makes a certain amount of sense. So in that regard, I think that for me, the idea of arche and tecton is like understanding the principles of the builder, or what are the first principles or origins of the builder's activity, were the things that were to be looked at. In my case, that was the generation, which I believe is kind of done through the metaphor, and I think through the tool, the process, through drawing. So next week, we will talk about drawing, and we'll talk about the kind of like it as an activity, as the kind of generator, or the kind of like facilitator of the generation. And I think that one of the things that I found is that drawing is that thing that I discovered was what I felt was, again, the weakness in the architectural activity. Not to kind of mention any names, but it was kind of funny that, at the moment I'm working on a project, and a certain architect of certain note was brought up, and I kind of like looked him up. I mean, I was aware of who he was. I mean, he was someone. It's actually someone I think I've engaged with on reviews or panels here in New York, because he's a New York architect, and it kind of noted that he was either an artist or a watercolorist, and I've always loved watercolors. I happen to be fortunately married to and engaged with the world's greatest watercolorist. So I thought to myself, hi, Pato. So I thought to myself, like, okay, let me look. So I looked and I thought, you know, and I was kind of like, I'm not going to say any, I just felt like they were incredibly poor, incredibly, oh, what would you say? I mean, it weren't even amateurish. I mean, it was like if you saw these things in a high school art class.
They were remedial.
Remedial. So I'm thinking of like, one of the things I think in is the fact that, like, if one engaged in an activity, there's a certain point at which a certain masterful quality is identifiable. And I think to reach that, it's kind of something that really gives you a certain authority in terms of that circumstance. These, if I was to say, I would say these things were things that were done after the fact to try to create the impression of an actual process, rather than actually that this was a process. It didn't seem, because it looked too contrived. It was hard to see that these were actually the generator. Now, fortunately, I had the good fortune to have had a brief engagement with someone who actually, I believe, who was a fairly well recognized architect who has passed on now. But in terms of his drawings were actually part of his generative strategy. And I felt that that was, though I don't feel any kind of kinship to his particular formal engagement or artifact or generation, because I felt his work was somewhat sentimental and kind of fad-ish, and not really rigorous enough. I didn't feel the need to kind of like move or continue to be in that direction, but I recognized it and respected it, kind of appreciated it. But I did see that in that case, at least, that sense that the drawings that were generated were indeed part of the generative strategy. So I felt that like that idea was not a crazy idea. So I think it is something that needs to be recognized and identified. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, because that's the nature of the talk for next week, is how, the drawing is the facilitator of the generative strategy in terms of how you can go about creating that. So the drawings that you actually generate are those things that you can start to recognize as having a certain potential in terms of what they are. And like I said, Julie and I had a really great talk. So I mean, I'm going to run, because I mean, it's I want to kind of go and play in the sandbox and see if these things. I mean, Julie has made me a catalog to start to use to kind of take my drawing skills, which I kind of feel need to kind of like facilitate the generation of character, of identification for artifact generation. So that's it for now. So next week we'll talk about drawings, and maybe maybe what I'll do is I'll actually take one of these things and kind of like, talk about it. Like saying this is what this is. This is how this works. This is what this is for. I plan to do that in general, but I'm not sure if it, like, maybe we get through the principles first. So we'll see. So anyway, as always, especially now, because it's becoming, and this is really weird, I'm not a political guy, but I find that like these ideas that I'm saying are actually kind of like becoming, again, part of an indictment of social kind of decay. I'm going to say it, and it's important. The realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to all of our benefit to keep it this way. So let's keep it this way. And one of the things I say now is that like it's really important. Stay free